A desert planet with twin suns.
Why do I sense we've picked up another pathetic life form?
Use my knowledge. Much to learn, you still have.
Welcome back to Twin Sun Talks, folks. I'm your host, Jonah Liu. Thank you so much for listening. This is not Prominent Alien Species You Need to Know Volume 4, like I said last week. Of course, the 1 week that I tried to get ahead of myself and be like, hey, stay tuned next week for this, it's not what I'm going over. Because I figured that it would be appropriate for me to rearrange some stuff and do things you need to know before diving into the Book of Boba Fett, because as a lot of y'all know, it is premiering, episode 1 is premiering this Wednesday, December 29th. So just kind of ahead of that, I wanted to just run through some important information that I think will be relevant to know once the show actually comes out. So without further ado, let's dive into visions.
To continue, we need one singular vision. My vision.
If you're new to the podcast, Visions is basically my segment where I go over theories and essentially just things that I would like to see or think that we will see in Star Wars projects moving forward. So basically this is speculation with a bit of kind of information kind of sprinkled in. So basically what I'm going to be doing is going through just a very basic timeline of Boba Fett and then what to expect from the show and a few things that you might want to know about going into it. And if you want my full profile on Boba Fett, I did that back in episode 43. And I did a couple other things. I think, a review in that episode as well. So if you want to just jump straight to the profile of Boba Fett, go to episode 43 and start around 9 minutes and 5 seconds, somewhere around there. And then listen all the way through, and you will get that there. But, and there's a much more detailed timeline for Boba Fett in that episode, but I'm just going to give a very basic one here. Boba Fett was an unaltered clone of Jango Fett, who was a Mandalorian bounty hunter during the events kind of before Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, and he adopted Boba as a son. He was an unaltered clone, meaning that most clones had accelerated growth to get them ready for combat faster, but Boba was left unchanged, just as kind of a normal human, just a clone of Jango. Jango was then killed by Jedi Master Mace Windu during the First Battle of Geonosis, and Boba swore revenge. Decades later, Boba was renowned as the most infamous bounty hunter in the galaxy, and he was hired by the Empire to hunt down the rebels after the Battle of Hoth. He delivered Han Solo frozen in carbonite to Jabba the Hutt, and then he fell into the Sarlacc pit battling Luke Skywalker and his companions in Return of the Jedi, and was assumed dead. But he re-emerged sometime before the events of The Mandalorian Season 2. We don't necessarily know how. And then he allies himself with Din Djarin and recovers his armor. Then after the events of Mando Season 2, he returns to Tatooine with bounty hunter Fennec Shand and takes the throne of the late Jabba the Hutt from Bib Fortuna. And if you didn't know, Bib Fortuna was in fact Jabba the Hutt's major domo, as we see in The Phantom Menace, as well as Return of the Jedi and a very brief cameo in The Bad Batch. But he was essentially an albino Twi'lek who kind of both translated for Jabba and acted as kind of a liaison for business deals that Jabba didn't want to travel to. As far as what to expect from the show, we know very little about what is going to be going down in it, which is kind of exciting, but also kind of off-putting just because, I don't know, I feel like we probably could be getting a little more information, but we know that there's going to be 7 episodes starting, like I said, this week on Wednesday, December 29th. And essentially the general synopsis that we've been given is that Boba is going to be learning the ropes of being a crime lord because he's very experienced in being a bounty hunter, but he wants to move past that and essentially rule now. And as he says in the trailers, he wants to rule with respect rather than ruling with fear, which is what Jabba did. I'm also expecting some sort of explanation for his escape from the Sarlacc. I'm guessing that just based on the trailers, he probably lived with the Sand People for a while, which I'll get into in a little bit. And then this is speculation, but if I had to guess, the book that is referred to in the show's title will be a sort of hit list of people who have wronged him in the past. So it's just going to be kind of like a checklist that he's just kind of marking off as he goes. Could be completely wrong there, but that's just something that makes sense to me. Alrighty, so this next bit is pretty much all speculation, but I still feel like it's relevant information to know going in, just in case some of these things happen. The first one, however, is pretty much guaranteed to be important information, and that is that Fennec Shand is the sharpshooter bounty hunter that's kind of now Boba's right-hand woman, as we see in all the trailers and at the end of Mandalorian Season 2. She's played by Ming-Na Wen, and she is awesome. We were first introduced to her in Mandalorian Season 1, and this was the gunslinger episode that was a little bit boring, but essentially she was presumed dead, but then she was healed and kind of brought back to life by Boba. We see her cybernetic enhancements in Mando Season 2, and she gained a reputation in the early days of the Empire, which we see a little bit of in The Bad Batch, which is the animated show that just aired its first season this past year. And she is indebted to Boba for saving her life, so she's kind of owes him a life debt, kind of like what we hear Jar Jar owing Qui-Gon in The Phantom Menace. So Fennec is pretty much definitely going to be a pretty major player in this, just based on how prominent she has been in the trailers. But moving right along, Cad Bane is probably going to be a pretty stinking significant player, if I had to guess, just based on things that we have seen recently in canon. And for those of you who don't know, Cad Bane was a bounty hunter who was introduced in the Clone Wars, so we haven't seen him in live action at all. But he is awesome, and he was kind of like, if Jango was kind of the top bounty hunter of his time, in the next era of the history of Star Wars, Cad Bane was probably the most infamous in like the Clone Wars era, and then afterwards it was Boba. And so Cad Bane and Boba were actually kind of rivals during the Clone Wars. And Cad Bane, he's of the species called Duro. And so they're essentially, they have blue skin and red eyes, no nose. They're really cool. He kind of talks like with a low gravelly voice, and he wears a big kind of cowboy hat. And he's extremely dangerous. Like I said, once one of the most formidable bounty hunters in the galaxy, and he was rivals with Boba during the Clone Wars. And an interesting thing is this isn't necessarily canon anymore, just because of things that we've seen happen in the Book of Boba, or not in the Book of Boba Fett, in the Bad Batch. But originally, in some unfinished episodes of the Clone Wars that didn't ever get aired because of contract difficulties whenever Disney acquired Lucasfilm from George, but unfinished episodes of the Clone Wars showed a standoff between Cad Bane and Boba after they had teamed up for like a bounty hunter job. Boba actually ended up killing Bane in a standoff, but Bane shot a dent in Boba's helmet, and that's where the iconic dent came from, in Boba's helmet. But that unfinished episode, which was considered canon until fairly recently, has been retconned because, spoiler alert for The Bad Batch, we see Cad Bane return alive and well in The Bad Batch, and he has some metal plating on his head, which makes me think that the duel did in fact take place, but instead of killing Bane, he just wounded him. And I think that since they brought Bane back for The Bad Batch, that he is almost a surefire addition to the cast of Book of Boba. Because I think that would be a huge climactic moment for like the end of the season, would be to have that standoff that we were supposed to see in animation actually in live action. I think that would be really cool. And if I had to guess, I think that maybe, potentially, it seems like all these kind of competing crime lords on Tatooine will kind of have it out for Boba as the new guy. And one of them might hire Bane to go after Boba, and I think that that's going to be really cool to see. Moving on, Mace Windu. Y'all already know. I mean, I've done a whole episode on what I think Windu has been doing this entire time and why I think that he's alive. I know that some people say that if he comes back, it kind of undermines the meaning of his death in the movies, but I don't care. I think that it would be really poetic to have him come back and have him be a sort of antagonist for Boba. Because, like I said before, he killed Boba's father right in front of him. And I think that it would be really poetic to have Boba kill Mace. Kind of have that closure. And if you would like to go back and listen to my episode about this being my theory about what Mace Windu has been doing since the events of Revenge of the Sith, go back and listen to episode 40 of this podcast. I think that that's one of my best episodes that I've done. It's one of the ones that I'm most proud of. But as y'all know, Mace Windu is my favorite character, and I would love to see him back in canon. Back alive in canon. I don't care what anybody else says. I think that would be dope. Anyways, so next up we have Bosk, who is Boba's Trandoshan ally, who's a fellow bounty hunter and an old friend. He kind of looks like a lizard. He's one of the bounty hunters in the lineup in Empire Strikes Back. We see him as kind of a companion and almost like guardian of Boba's in the Clone Wars. I think that it's a pretty safe bet that he's going to show up, so watch out for him. Dengar, another bounty hunter in the lineup in Empire Strikes Back. He was a formidable ally to Boba of the Imperial era. He wears extensive bandaging, and actually in Legends, so not in canon, so this isn't necessarily true in the timeline that we see now, but in Legends, Dengar actually saved Boba from the Sarlacc. And so I think that it would make sense for him to show up, at least for a little cameo, to kind of have some of his bounty hunting buddies back. Road to the Hutt is Jabba the Hutt's son, who once again we're introduced to him in the Clone Wars. It's unclear what happened to him after the Clone Wars, and so I think that it would be kind of cool to see him running another part of Jabba's criminal underworld, maybe, and kind of get that sort of, because they kind of forgot about him, I feel like, and so I think that would be a really interesting thing to see. Why didn't he fill the power void left by his father's death? I think that it would be cool to get some answers there. So yeah, Road to the Hutt, Jabba the Hutt's son. Din Djarin is the Mandalorian, as y'all know, and I could see him coming back and seeking Boba's aid and setting up Season 3 of The Mandalorian, which is supposed to air sometime at the end of next year or at the beginning of 2023. It's unclear. We haven't really gotten any official confirmation for that yet. Next up, Hondo Anaka. This might be one of my top 3 that I really want to see. It would be Cad Bane, Mace Windu, and Hondo Anaka. Hondo Anaka is a weak-way pirate introduced in the Clone Wars. He's very funny and charismatic and also kind of shady and selfish. But he's honestly one of the best characters in Star Wars, in my opinion. He is the perfect combination of, like, comic relief, but also, like, really savvy and also fits the plot really well. But he also was a good friend of Jango's and was kind of a pseudo-mentor to Boba, when he was a child and seeking revenge against Mace Windu. And he's also always looking to turn a profit. And Boba, as we know from the trailers for this show, is looking to become rich through cooperation with all of Jabba's previous captains. And so I think that it would make a lot of sense for Hondo to kind of get wind of this and come looking for a piece of the pie. Next up, and this is probably less likely, but I think that if Dengar and Bosk show up, that this is still a possibility. A character named Embo. And if y'all haven't watched the Clone Wars, I highly recommend that y'all do. It's a great show. And if y'all are trying to get into Star Wars, it's a very fun and easy way to do so. Easy is maybe a little bit of a subjective way to do it, or to say it. But if y'all want a more manageable way, it's 7 seasons, so it's definitely a commitment. But if y'all want a more manageable way to watch it, go back to my 2nd and 3rd episode of this podcast. I go through a roadmap of the Clone Wars and kind of hit the most important episodes, because it's honestly potentially one of my, or if not, is my favorite part of Star Wars canon, just for the rewatchability factor alone, but that might just be me. So, yeah, go ahead and do that. But Embo is a character introduced in the Clone Wars. He's a Kyuzo bounty hunter. He has green skin and a metal hat, kind of a metal disc hat. He's one of the coolest characters from the Clone Wars, in my opinion. And he's a bounty hunter that worked with Boba in some capacity at some point during the Clone Wars. So, once again, I think that if certain other characters show up, then it's not that far from the mark, but he's also just a really cool character that I would like to see brought to life in live action. I think that you should know a little bit about the Crime Syndicates. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I think that you should at least know the names of them. So the Pikes were essentially galactic drug dealers. We see them in charge of the spice mines on Kessel in Solo, a Star Wars story. They kind of have boxy, helmeted heads, and they're kind of like hippies almost, or stoners, but they are very dangerous. And we see them featured pretty heavily in the Clone Wars. And if you want to learn a bit of lingo, spice is kind of like the Star Wars equivalent to just drugs, narcotics, and stimulants and stuff like that. So if you hear them talking about spice being a spice runner, it's essentially a drug dealer. The Hutts are Outer Rim gangsters. They kind of specialize in smuggling, and they have really great influence over many Outer Rim territories. We see that with Jabba, and we see, once again, a little more of it in the Clone Wars. The Black Sun primarily dealt with slave trading and smuggling. They were based on Mustafar and Ord Mantell. Just some more gangsters to know. I wouldn't say that that they have green skin. They're a character called Faline. I think that it could be important. And then Crimson Dawn was the crime ring started by Darth Maul after the Clone Wars, after his Shadow Collective failed. We see a bit of it in Solo, a Star Wars story as well. So all those could be mentioned, and I'll make sure to point it out if it is with my weekly reviews and breakdowns, but I felt like those were worth mentioning. Okay, Omega. She's super interesting, and she was first introduced this year. She's a recent addition to canon, and she was introduced during the Bad Batch show. And she is the only other unaltered clone of Jango Fett. So if Boba was Alpha, his codename was Alpha, she is Omega, so the first and the last. And she is a female clone of Jango Fett, which is very interesting. She also seems to be quite a bit younger than Boba, by like a few years. And she was last seen on the run from the Empire with Clone Force 99 after the events of the Bad Batch show. So it's unclear how she might play in, but I wouldn't be surprised if they brought her in somehow as kind of a sister and potential future partner, or maybe a rival to Boba. We'll see. I don't know. Could be interesting, though. The Sand People, like I said earlier, I'm guessing that they're the ones that kind of took Boba in. They are the Tusken Raiders. We see them on Tatooine most times that we visit there. They're featured very heavily in The Mandalorian. They're also featured in like A New Hope, in The Phantom Menace, and Attack of the Clones. They're the people that are wrapped in bandages, and you don't really see anything of their like skin, but you hear them roar and them growl and stuff. They're those kind of guys. They are very primitive and territorial and very protective of their own. And I think that it'd be super interesting to see Boba kind of commune with them and kind of have them nurse him back to health. The Krait's Claw was Boba's bounty hunter group that he formed during the Clone Wars as a teenager, and members included Bosk, Dengar, and Embo, among others. So I think that those characters could be brought back in either as people trying to take Boba out, hired by other crime lords, or as allies, or maybe enemies turned allies. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that it could be something really cool and something that could be really interesting to see moving forward. And then finally, Slave One is Boba's starship, and there's been some controversy around renaming it, but I don't know. I'm still going to call it Slave 1. And it's Boba's ship that was passed on to him from his father. The biggest thing that I think is worth noting is the seismic charges that are in it. They were featured in both The Mandalorian and Attack of the Clones, Episode 2. And they drop from the back, and what they do is they implode on themselves and take in all the surrounding sound from the area, which means that all of the noise cuts out, and then explode back outwards and kind of with like a ring of destructive sound. And it has one of the most iconic noises in Star Wars that it makes, and I can't really recreate it here, but I think that it's worth noting. And Boba Ship's very iconic, and I think that it'll be featured pretty prominently in one way or another in the show. So I figured it was worth noting as well. But that's about all that I have. If anything else comes up, I'll be sure to talk about it in my weekly reviews. And that being said, make sure you stay tuned from here until when the show ends. I'm going to be doing reviews every Wednesday that we get an episode. And so if once you've watched it and you want to hear me break down some Easter eggs that I feel like were worth noting, then make sure you tune in for those. And I'm super excited because there's only been one other show that's come out since I've started this, and so I'm ready to kind of start reviewing content, and it's super exciting for me as a kind of a new content creator for Star Wars to be doing that kind of stuff. So that's all that I have, but this wouldn't be a proper episode if I didn't leave y'all with just a little bit more. All right, so today what I got for y'all is that the symbol on Boba Fett's pauldron, it's like an orange pauldron shoulder plate for his armor, is a mythosaur skull sigil, and it represented the legacy of the now extinct mythosaurs that were a dominant species native to the planet Mandalore a millennia before the events, or several millennia before the events of the Book of Boba Fett. The beasts were eradicated by Mandalore the First and his followers as they claimed the world of Mandalore for their own. And so, essentially, they use these creatures as kind of the mark of the Mandalorians as a sort of sign of respect for them, because while they had to kill them to claim Mandalore as their own, they still had great respect for the beasts and wanted to show that through using them as their sort of emblem. And so that's about all that I have. We also see the mythosaur skull featured prominently in The Mandalorian and the Armorer's Chamber and stuff like that. But that's about all that I have for today's episode. Make sure that you tune in, watch the Book of Boba Fett on Wednesday, come back, listen to my reviews and breakdowns. Next week is going to be a prominent species in Star Wars Volume 4. So make sure you stay tuned for that. I'm sorry if you were looking forward to it this week. But I hope that this was helpful for you either way. So that being said, you've taken your first steps into a larger world. May the Force be with you, and I will see y'all in the next episode. Bye, friends.